Let's get some up-to-the-minute political analysis from Lara Spirit, Deputy Political Editor of the Sunday Times. Welcome.
Hi Ed, how are you?
Very well. Let's talk about Sir Keir Starmer. He's given this actually interesting interview about standing down as Prime Minister.
It was tough. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Really, really tough. As I grappled with what was the best thing to do for me, for the country, for the government. And those discussions inevitably start with many discussions with colleagues, with parliamentary colleagues, with the team here, with my immediate advisors, with trade unions, so many people in that discussion. But for me, and this may be different for other people, in the end, it became an intensely personal decision.
Well, that was Sir Keir Starmer talking to the BBC. Lara Spirit, was there anything of interest in that interview for you?
Yeah, there was, actually. I thought it was interesting. It was a more candid interview than we're used to from Keir Starmer, who is, not minded to give any display of, personal feeling, I think, in his interviews. So it was interesting to see this, obviously marking 2 years in office. He knows that there will not be a third. And I thought, what stood out to me, I think his attitude towards Andy Burnham stood out. He insisted there'd never been any animosity between him and Burnham, but nor did he even refer to Burnham as the successor. He said, there's a little bit of a process to go, whoever my successor may be. Now, that might be, and I think probably is more likely, Starmer being a very process-driven man who knows that, of course, there is a process, and even though Andy Burnham is the heir apparent and it looks vanishingly unlikely that anybody would dare to challenge him, let alone come close to winning, that, Starmer wants to maintain the existing process as it is. I think what he was saying about his time spent on international affairs was also quite interesting. So one of the things that allies of Andy Burnham will say to you is, they're not criticising Starmer, but they will say this is somebody who's very domestic focused. And actually this was something that, Andy Burnham majored on in a very big way when he was running in Makerfield. He wanted to focus hugely on domestic issues. We had that big devolution speech from him on Monday this week. But what Starmer is essentially saying in this interview, and of course you remember that tagline, never hear Keir, for the fact that he had gone on all these many foreign trips and was clearly very energised by his role as head of the UK in a foreign capacity. What Starmer is saying is you don't really have a choice. You do have to spend this much time on foreign affairs. He says, I don't think it's possible to do it any other way. That's not a criticism of Burnham, but it is an insistence that actually the way that he has run this government, taking a huge amount of focus on these things, is because he thinks that he had no alternative, particularly keen on saying that actually, when you say you're going to focus on the cost of living and not on foreign issues, that in his view is pretty stupid. He's saying obviously foreign issues, particularly things like the Strait of Hormuz, have a direct bearing on the cost of living that people are feeling at home. So he was defensive in that respect. And I think, like we've just heard in that clip there, just the kind of personal tone of it, the reflection on the fact that he, had clearly mulled this over with his family top of mind when he was deciding when to go. And so as a moment that sort of marks his departure, I think is interesting. And we should say that it was also published alongside a video, a sort of near 12-minute video that he has put out where he talks about his achievements in office to mark those 2 years.
Well, so that's his own video.
His own video on his own social media, which is, again, clearly an attempt to shore up his legacy, to speak to his successes. When everybody is talking about what Andy Burnham is going to do in office, Keir Starmer wants to talk about what he has done in office. And I think, he wants to say he's going to Ankara for the NATO summit next week. That will be his kind of final big trip abroad. They have had announcements in recent days, an apology on forced adoptions, for example. They're keen to say they're getting on with the work. But of course, this is the final near fortnight of Keir Starmer's premiership. And I think this interview is an important moment to mark that.
Absolutely. It'll be interesting whether Andy Burnham can spend more time abroad, because he's likely to be stuck on an Avanti train somewhere between Manchester and London. But, the King is dead and long live the King. So we're all talking about what a Burnham premiership will look like. And one of the figures who's become the sort of lightning rod is Ed Miliband. And there's this intervention, it's on the front page of the Times today, by Donald Trump's team saying, don't make Ed Miliband your chancellor, because obviously as energy secretary he's apparently been opposed to North Sea drilling, although he might say otherwise. If I was Andy Burnham, I would tell the Americans to get in the sea on this. Probably a point. But the Ed Miliband thing is becoming almost going to define the Burnham premiership before it sets off, whatever decision he makes.
Yeah, so they are obviously insistent, those around Burnham, that there have been no personnel decisions that were made. And indeed, when Andy Burnham himself spoke to LBC this week, he said he was yet to make up his mind on his pick for Chancellor. So that is an open question. We've, of course, had an intervention from these senior Trump administration officials who have warned the UK against doing this. Now, it's a well-known fact that President Trump has very strong views on the ban on new oil and gas drilling in the North Sea. You know, he thinks it's a terrible idea. His ambassador to the UK has said publicly that it's baffling. So it's not necessarily surprising that that's their stance, but it is interesting that they see Miliband, who is of course the energy secretary, as the crucial figure, the totemic figure that represents that particular ideology. In their view, it is an ideology, and that makes them concerned about a pick for Chancellor. I mean, whether or not Andy Burnham takes any heed of this, I think is an interesting question. Like you say, I think he will be aware that, you know, polling in the UK shows that, you know, voters have particularly soured on Trump even more than they had done before. But I think having a good relationship with the US will be something that Burnham wants. And so these things will be, it is a very, very interesting intervention. I think it will be weighed carefully.
Yeah, I think Andy Burnham, you know, Trump is so odd that, you know, I could see Andy Burnham going to Washington and charming Trump, and Trump saying, oh, I like the cut of the jib of this young man, and I don't know, they'll talk about what a great success the World Cup was. But anyway, Andy Burnham has gone on this forum called Reddit, and apparently there was a section called Ask Me Anything, and people did ask him anything, and he avoided a few questions: transgender rights, the social media ban, how to tackle student loan debt. But he did say he's ruling out an early election. I think that's quite significant, although I suspect it was more odds on that he would than wouldn't, as it were. Talking to the Taliban to get failed asylum seekers back to Afghanistan, slightly odd. And electoral reform, I thought, was quite an interesting thing, that he said he hoped electoral reform would be in Labour's next manifesto. That's quite a big thing.
Yeah, so, I mean, what's interesting about this is that actually, I think there's a bit of a mood at the moment to say that Andy Burnham is not answering any questions. But we have had quite a lot of Andy Burnham since the beginning of the Makerfield by-election, and he has commented on almost all of these topics. So take electoral reform, for example. This was a big question early on because he has been a huge advocate of electoral reform, but they did rule out electoral reform before the next election. One of the key things that they are trying to do, and one of the things that he is committed to, and he committed to yesterday in the Reddit thread, was to stick to the manifesto. And so they don't want to do things that aren't in the Labour manifesto, in part because, as we've seen, they've ruled out an early general election. There is this wider mandate question. They are mindful of doing things that stray beyond the bounds of that which was in that crucial document ahead of the 2024 general election. What struck out to me from the Ask Me Anything that I sat in on was actually, I mean, so firstly they crashed Reddit, which was, although there was a technical malfunction.
Is that because there were so many people on the forum?
There were a lot of people on the forum, and there were a lot of people, crucially, I think one of the most popular questions was about the triple lock. That was asked by a number of users. Andy Burnham committed to keeping that. He had committed to keeping that in a previous interview with the iPaper, but it has been something in recent weeks that some of those giving him advice, crucially I think Jim O'Neill, who of course former Goldman Sachs banker who has been advising Burnham, has said publicly that has told the Sunday Times that he is trying to get Burnham to scrap the triple lock. And there have been hopes, I think, among some, looking at the fiscal situation, looking at the fact that he was handed this multi-billion-pound black hole this week to fund the long-awaited defence investment plan, but looking at some of the other things that he would like to do in government, to say, well, maybe he will look again at the way that we operate the state pension, for example. But actually, he clearly yesterday committed to keeping that. Is that surprising? Not really. Do you really think Andy Burnham is going to come in and one of his first acts in government is to curtail the benefits to millions of pensioners? I mean, in blunt electoral terms, I think it's a difficult sell. That's not to say that you can't see them doing it at some point in the future. That's not to say it won't be up for grabs in an upcoming manifesto. Let's see. But I'm not massively surprised by that. There was a bit of sparring with Kemi Badenoch also on Reddit, who accused him. She went onto Reddit to ask him a question because she says he's been taking softball questions, because Reddit as a forum is people post their questions. Andy Burnham can choose which ones he answers, right? I mean, he's not, as you've just relayed some of the topics that he steered clear of yesterday, and that to some opposition politicians signals somebody who is nervous about media exposure. He didn't take questions from journalists after his big speech on Monday, for example. Are we going to hear more from him? He's got a couple of weeks left until.
What did Kemi ask him?
She just basically said, you're taking softball questions, if I recall correctly, and I'm definitely misquoting her, but something like, will you come out and have some proper scrutiny? Something along those lines. He said back to her something along the lines of, we had the Makerfield, I answered the questions of 70,000 or odd voters in the Makerfield by-election very recently. Both of them will feel pretty good with that kind of, harmless sparring. But I think that when you speak to people around Burnham, they will say, look, it's not like he's doing this Reddit forum to avoid any scrutiny. He's doing this Reddit forum because they think one of his key strengths is that he can engage in humorous terms sometimes, lightheartedly, but also properly with other voters and connect with people. And this is a good way to demonstrate that he can do that and to demonstrate that he has quite a unique appeal in that regard. It's
an interesting point, actually, isn't it? I mean, do you remember there was a time when kind of political leaders used to go on a radio station and host their own question and answer session? I mean, I wonder, because obviously Burnham has this kind of TikTok thing going on, and there is this kind of, and politicians always go on about it. We're going to bypass the traditional media. We're going to talk directly to people. Maybe he will, as Prime Minister, do a Reddit forum once a month. Maybe. Quite a good idea.
So they did one during the Makerfield by-election. I think they are very pro this forum. I mean, we should say, I think you're right to say that this has been a trend from other politicians. Keir Starmer, of course, invited influencers into Downing Street. That was a kind of big part of their appeal, is recognising the fact that there are other brokers when it comes to communicating with the public and voters than the traditional media. And I don't think many people would argue with that. And that's been a big part of politics in the US as well, particularly with the White House briefing room. You see them bringing in influencers there as well. So I don't think that's hugely surprising that he's necessarily done that. And also, we should say he did do an interview with LBC this week. He did sit down with Andrew Marr, and that was quite revealing, particularly on tax, that he thought that, that he was not committing to raising those main taxes, but clearly felt there was a way to be creative in other respects within the bounds of the manifesto, saying that he hadn't made up his mind on his chancellor, for example. Also giving more of an insight into the fact that it clearly sounded like he found it quite frustrating, all the speculation on the personalities that might staff his government. So I think in that respect, these interviews are quite interesting. But look, I think it's also worth pointing out when we speak about this, he is a seriously busy man right now. Yeah. He's come down to London. He's got a little over a fortnight until he's expected to walk through the steps of Downing Street. He hasn't staffed Downing Street. He hasn't decided on some of the key picks in his government. He's got tons and tons of 24 intake MPs who he's never met, who he's having to meet en masse at the moment, who are making various entreaties to him, to those around him in his inner circle about what they would want to do in his government, what the issues they care about, what it was that Starmer got wrong. And he has made a big play of being somebody who, doesn't like the traditional whipping system, wants to be very collegiate, doesn't want to run a super hierarchical Labour Party or Number 10. So these weeks of meeting all of these various stakeholders, including union leaders, for example, are really, really important. That is competing for time with doing media interviews about issues that he doesn't know the answer to yet. So I think it's not necessarily hard to understand why they're taking this approach. I'm not defending it, but I just think it's quite easy to see why it's happened.
Totally right. Lara Spirit, Deputy Political Editor of the Sunday Times, soon to be Deputy Editor, I'm sure. Lara, thanks so much for coming on and talking us through the political stories of the day. You can